Thank you for listening to Offline and Unfiltered. We are your hosts, Lakeisha and Megan.
On this podcast, we bring you unfiltered conversations on business and culture through listener stories, expert interviews, and a little bit of shit talking. Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to Offline and Unfiltered. We are so excited to have our guest Jane with us today, and we're going to be having a really fun conversation centered around what is your boss thinking? Before we dive in, I'm going to pass to Jane to have her introduce herself. So Jane, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Lakeisha. I think I'm very excited to be here because so a little bit about me. I'm currently the COO of a women's mental health startup called Lunajoy. I have been a manager slash boss for over 13 years now, managing teams of one to managing teams in the hundreds, also having direct reports of one to direct reports over 25. So I've definitely been across the board in terms of being different types of managers and now being in the C-suite. So I'm really excited to share, what it's like in the life of a manager and that we're not all monsters.
Well, that's amazing. Thanks so much for sharing a little bit. I'm always curious with folks. Did you start out in your career wanting to be a people leader? Like that was something you were striving for, or was greatness kind of thrusted upon you due to circumstance?
Yeah, I think as I was growing up, it was always embedded in my head that in order for you to be successful, you have to manage people. I don't believe that is the case in today's world. But that was kind of what was taught to me. So yeah, I've always tried to, I started off climbing the corporate ladder, not in the startup space. So I've always looked for opportunities to be like team lead or having headcounts. And so I would say, even though I didn't proactively ask to manage a team, I've always tried to show that I could manage the team. So eventually that was, given to me.
Describe like the first time you managed people? What was the environment? What was the role? And how did you jump into that sort of world?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of different types of, of people management. You first start as sort of a team lead where the people don't necessarily report to you, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you still need to delegate work to them. You're still kind of accountable for their work, and you're accountable for the whole project or the whole product. So I started there, being the team lead. And I think that was, less of a learning curve to me just because in school I was always, in group projects, I was always that girl.
It's like,
that was like
you being bad at school is not going to impact my grade, okay?
Right, right.
Yeah, I was always that girl, be like, you're going to do this, you're going to do that, we're going to group, and this is what we're going to do, and I'm going to present, right? Like, I was always that person. So being the team lead, it was almost like the same. But I think what was a learning curve is that, that accountability became a lot more serious. And as I got into not just a team lead, but as an actual manager, I had like my first team, I think was only a team of 2. But their performance reflected on your performance. And it was your job to either have hard conversations, to, give them poor feedback, to doing, the ugly things like the PIPs and all of that. Like, that was when I think people management, like that, I had a learning curve at the start of my people management journey.
Mm.
Yeah. And for listeners that may not be familiar, PIP or PIP is a performance improvement plan. So it's a tool that managers and HR people use. If someone's not doing too well, you put them on a performance improvement plan, and that way they can improve their own performance over time, hopefully. Uh, what do you think were some of the things that you didn't expect in management? You were talking a little bit about the accountability piece. I think that's an interesting piece to expand upon because I think a
Hmm.
lot of leaders and also employees don't really understand that dynamic of you go from an individual contributor where your work is your work and that's all you're evaluated on to now you're responsible for the work of your team, but also the environment you're creating and things like that.
Yeah. So I think when it comes to, people management, what I didn't expect is, one, I kind of knew that, I was accountable for the whole thing, but I didn't know how difficult it was to get everybody to do exactly what you envision. Because as an individual contributor, you are in control of yourself. Like we are all in control of ourselves, right? We actually don't have much control over anybody else, right? Management is never about control, right? It's like a mutual relationship. So it, and I think like developing that the communication skills, right? And not just like communicate clearly, you also have to inspire them, right? You also have to motivate your team. If even if you communicate, I want you to, do A, B, and C, they might understand, but they might not understand the purpose of it. So they might not be as creative or as committed to the task. So I think having like very clear communication and also like empathy is important in your communication. And also, right, as you manage a team of different people respond to different types of communication and different types of information. And you almost have to be like their shrink, right? I mean,
Hmm.
I joke about this with myself, I have like my one-on-ones with my team. I've had like one-on-ones with my multiple teams for many years now. And it's almost like it is almost like a therapy session, right? How are you doing? Making sure that they feel empowered, they continue to feel empowered and continue to understand the mission. Um, and I think being able to really understand like the different types of people and how what they respond to and how to communicate with them and what type of frequency, like some people they don't want to be like blabbered at all the
Hmm.
time. Some people need it, right?
Hmm.
And that was the I think that is probably the biggest learning curve for somebody coming from individual contributor, where you have full control over your output, over whatever you do, to like not having full control, but needing to, you know, inspire people and really like motivate people to follow your lead.
Yeah. I do want to just kind of underscore the comment you made about control, that leadership is not about control. And I would love for you to just share with our listeners a little bit more about that, because when I see an impasse with leader and one of their direct reports, it's generally because the leader is operating in a sphere of control versus trying to inspire
Mm-hmm.
or influence a positive outcome. And so can you just share with our listeners a little bit more about how you came to that conclusion that leadership isn't about control?
I think it's being an employee myself, right? I am an employee that is absolutely anti micromanagement and anti control. And I think about it like from like us as all human. I say this to my team, like even though I'm your boss, like we're the same. Like we're human. We all have 24 hours in a day. We all have our own lives, right? And our own stressors. We're not that different. And um and human beings naturally don't respond well. I mean, obviously in the extreme situation where, right, you're brainwashed and all of that, but we won't go into that. In a normal situation, right? Um like we don't like to be controlled. Like we want to have our own autonomy. Like we have our own ideas, right? And especially in a working environment that requires creativity and requires sort of problem solving and critical thinking. Um, so I think one, to answer your question, Lakeisha, one is like I'm reflecting on what I was like as an employee and what I would like my managers to be. I've been fortunate enough to have like really great managers when I was an individual contributor to learn from. They like gave me my room. They they've communicated what the goal was, but like never was like breathing down my neck saying you have to do one, two, three, and four. Um, and they really let me like drive the result while giving me enough support. And so I think so that's number one. And the other thing is, when I first started being a manager, I actually, it was a learning curve. Like I wasn't the best manager. I'm still not the best manager, right? I'm always like learning, right? And I would just see, when I'm in a meeting and when I ask, when I phrase the problem as a question, right? And I give people room to answer and to think about the problem, the result is much better than just me saying, okay, I need you to do one, two, three. This is the solution. And it's because like, any manager's brain is not as good as is as the group, as the brain power of the group, right? Everyone have their own perceptions. Everyone have their own ideas. Um, so when I think about like as a manager, what's my goal, right? My goal is that I need to drive the outcome of what the business needs, or even more. Um, and I've seen better outcome when I manage in this way. So that's how, that's when I decided, okay, managing it isn't about a top down sort of control relationship.
That was really insightful, Jane. I love what you said about you actually are modeling behavior that worked for you in the past, because I've noticed a lot of time when I talk to folks, when I ask them like how they came up with their managerial style, a lot of times it's the opposite. They're like, I had a bad boss, and so I go out of my way to not be that person, which I think is also a good strategy. You don't want to make people feel the way maybe you've felt in the past if you had a poor manager. But I love what you just said about I'm actually modeling my behavior based on good bosses I've had, because I think that that's really what makes the difference between like being a good boss and being like a really good boss is the sorts of behaviors that inspire and empower people. I love that you've used those terms a couple times. What do you think are some of the mistakes that managers, either all the way up in executive leadership, make, or even more junior managers make, that you've either seen or experienced that you also try to not do when you're leading your own teams?
Well, the number one thing I think I think it's micromanagement. I think um, a lot of especially experienced managers who are also experts in, like, who are not general managers, right? Who are experts in their specific technical skill or whatnot. Um, they like to do things a certain way, right? And they expect their team to do it exactly the same way that they have done it. And that's where, like, you know, it's really hard, I think, also, like, all of these are like very normal human behaviors, right? It's very hard to, you know, if you've been eating a hot dog with ketchup all your life, and one day somebody is like, "No, you got to eat it with mustard," you're gonna feel uncomfortable, right? You're gonna be like, "No, no, no, you need to eat this with ketchup." And I think it's like taking away that control. And when you have, especially when you have a new team, um, I can relate to, like, it is hard to kind of like, kind of like close one eye and say like, okay, this person's got it. I'm gonna see how it goes, right? And it does take it does take willpower to kind of like, to stay in the background a little bit and see how it plays out and give it time. Um, so micromanagement, I think I've seen across like senior or junior managers who just have a really hard time not having that, like, those like very detailed control over, over the everyday. And it and what this does is that, one, you're not allowing your team to thrive. You're not allowing the person to have their better ideas, potentially better ideas than you, right? So you are only as good as yourself, which is so dangerous for an organization, because I always say I want to hire people who are smarter than me. I want to hire people who are
Yes.
better than me, because then I don't have to do all the thinking. I'm human, right? Like, I'm tired. so um so it's, so that is like one, or from an organization perspective, I think that is like very detrimental. um I think from like the employee perspective, they come into an environment, it's like, well, I just have to do A, B, and C because my manager tells me to do A, B, and C, and that is good enough, right? And um and they will eventually, okay, if they are also reflecting on their career potential and all of that, they are going to feel thwarted, like, well, like, what's my next thing? Like, I'm not allowed to have my own ideas, and I don't have an opportunity to shine. And I think, I think well, not just high performers, just like, I think usually employees, I mean, there's different types of employees, but the employees who want to come into an organization to perform, um, they want to have opportunity to use the organization as a platform for them to show what they're able to do. And you need to give them the stage, right? Um, so micromanagement is my number one, like, big no-no. Um, so yeah, so that's probably my answer.
Yeah.
It's very painful to see.
I always say micromanagement is a fear response. It's fear. It's if they don't do it exactly how I would do it, they might do it wrong. And then to that accountability piece we just talked about, then I'm going to be accountable because they didn't do it right. I know best. And I know me personally, I think I struggled with that early. And when I was a manager, of just like,
Hmm.
well, no, I know the right way to do it. So I'm going to do it the right way and you're going to do it the right way. Right. And I think
Hmm.
what you said is so powerful. I have heard and read in a lot of recent studies that like growth is the number one thing that people want. They want
Mm-hmm.
growth, they
Yeah.
want growth.
Yeah.
And I think a misconception is that means they just want to be promoted all the time. And that's not necessarily true.
Hmm.
Good people want to be hired to do a job and they want to learn on that job and they want to grow their skills that they could potentially maybe continue to grow in your organization, or maybe take those skills and go somewhere else and do something
Yeah.
different. And so I think that's so powerful of what you said, like hire great people, train them, get out of their way, let them do their work. Because that's what most
Yeah.
people want to do.
Yeah. And it's really interesting too. I think of micromanagement as like it leads to the death of being a student of your environment, right? Because when you think of exactly what you said, Jane, about like getting out of their way, autonomy, having the best employees, like you not being the expert. So if you think about that in a practical setting, you're telling someone how to think and how to operate, right? And so when you're taking away their ability to think through a problem, they're losing that skill of solving something. So now you're
Mm-hmm.
enabling that person of being a professional because now they're going to come to you and say, Jane, what should I do? Versus,
Yeah.
hey, Jane, this is a solution I'm thinking about. Do you see any barriers with this? And so you're handicapping your team. And it's interesting about people who lead in a micromanagement philosophy. I don't think they see it that way. And it's really creating an environment where you're not giving your employees the opportunity to fail forward, right? Like, let them fail. It's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we learn from our failures more than we learn from our successes. So I just want to give you kudos for not leading in fear or control and knowing that that's like the worst avenue to go down.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, I think it also shows like if you're, even if you have, a team that have ideas and you're micromanaging them, you know, they're going to not tell you their ideas because they're going to say, well, you know, Jane doesn't want my ideas because Jane, her style is that she gets to tell us what to do, right? So you're losing, honestly, you're losing valuable asset, right? Because you are not getting everything that this person can offer. Um yeah, so I think it's just yeah, micromanagement is no go.
Yeah. I'd love to spend a minute on the freedom to fail comment, which I think is especially in startups, you hear it a lot, right? It's like, you have the
Mhm.
freedom to fail here. But when push comes to shove, it's like very actually not really reality. So, Jade, I think especially as a C-suite, I would love to hear like what freedom to fail means to you, especially as you think about it with
Yeah.
with your team. Because I think it's easy for folks to say, like, you can make mistakes here and it's okay. But then you hear the other side of, like, I made this mistake and everyone made a really big deal about it. And now I feel like I'm in trouble and I'm not going to get promoted. I'm not going to get a raise. And so I think that that's really stressful for employees, especially when they're in those sorts of environments.
Yeah, I think there's a technical aspect of freedom to fail and there's like a people aspect. I think in a startup or in like big corporate, like um you always have to limit your scope of failure, right? When you're testing something from a project perspective, if you have an idea, you're obviously, not going to launch it to your 100 million customers from day one. Like you'll pick a cohort and you'll test it. And that is sort of, I mean, that is the technical aspect of testing new things, right? You always test small and then you fail. Um, and, you know, actually we just had, a similar situation that happened to me where we thought we took a pretty big mistake on a large population, and I gotta say, like when I found out as a C-suite, again, like at the end of the day, it didn't actually get like launched, but we thought it was launched, and everybody thought it was launched. So at that moment, as C-suite, when I found out, you know, it was less about the people involved, right? Like what was like immediately in my head where my hair, I felt like my follicles were burning, my heart was, my heart was racing, and I couldn't speak coherently. um, and I think most of the time I thought about like the impacted customers, right? Like, like what am I gonna do to make this better. um, and I think that is the one that is the first thing I think most. I mean, I don't know if most managers think that way. I would think so, right? You think about the problem first. And then we went through a retrospective, right, of like what had happened, what is doing well, what is not doing well, and I think at that point, as a leader, what I do is I understand people are going to be really nervous about their jobs. Like, oh my God, like we just potentially made this huge mistake, and it was because of another mistake that it didn't get launched, thankfully, but still mistakes
We
all
love when
around.
that happens.
Yeah, failures all around, right? um so the first thing that I would do is like that initial fear in employees, like, oh my God, am I gonna lose my job? I gotta like put together my resume or whatever. So I kind of addressed it just directly, you know, and just talked about, okay, this was a mistake. We need to learn from it, but also you please don't think that you need to go and update your CVs, right? Let's look at like what actually happened and what do we need to do to either have like checks in place in terms of the process, change the process, whether it needs upskilling or whatnot, and really talk about it. And in the retrospective, I also talk about like what I could have done better, right?
Mm.
As C-suite, because as C-suite or as a manager, you are accountable for everybody, not just the mid managers who get in trouble, right? You were CC'd in that email saying that, hey, it launched, it didn't trigger you. Well, what's going on there, Jane?
Mhm.
Right? So I think it's almost like making the team feel like you are a part of the team. Like you're not just some person floating up on top monitoring everybody. So I think that kind of like made the team feel more comfortable to owning up to their mistakes and feeling more accountable and not being fearful and all of that. Um, you know, so I think, if a company or if a team ended up, having such a big mistake that it impacted a large, having a large impact on the business, um, I would also just probably question like the management, right? Like, did we put in safety nets in place for this not to happen? Um, and like, what is the root cause of it? And it's really everybody has a play in it.
Yeah, I find that like when mistakes happen, especially like larger scale mistakes, like it's very rarely like one person fucked up. Like
Mhm.
that's just
Yeah,
not really
Yeah.
how that works. It's
yeah,
because that's not how a company works. I mean, if your entire
hmm
company hinges on one person making a mistake, that's a big deal. Like you should probably like reevaluate how your work is assigned.
yeah,
Mhm.
Um, I love a lot of what you're saying. I think especially like the fact that you're willing to own mistakes. I think that's so important. I think folks who are interviewing right now for new jobs, ask your boss about a time like the last time they made a mistake and the team corrected them and how they handled it. It's a great
Mhm.
interview question to make
yeah,
sure your boss is like willing to admit mistakes. Um, but I one of the things that Jay and you and I talked about with Lakeisha is just there's a big like wave of like really negative sentiment towards like C executives, leadership in general. There's lots of sassy, also very funny TikToks out there, like
yeah,
kind of picking on like the millennial manager versus the boomer manager, what have you. So I would love to like spend a little time there and maybe just start with you, Jane, personally. Like, how does it feel to be like an executive in this time where there's like pretty negative sentiment around like businesses and
yeah.
executives in general? Like, what is that like for you personally?
Um, I think the first thing I think when I love those TikToks, by the way. TikTok loves sending them to me. It's great for my mental health, you know. Um, so the first thing is like, you know, you you don't know like what's going on in your boss's life, you know, because there are, your boss might be like, for example, like I'm COO, right? Like currently I have like over 10 direct reports. I oversee many different functions. Um, and when I'm talking to one person, for example, if I'm talking to tech, right? They don't know what I'm doing on the marketing side. They don't know what I'm doing on the sales side. They don't know what I'm doing on like different ops, right? Like ops teams. Um, so I think it's, I think there's obviously like very black and white things about like what's a good manager or what's a bad manager. But at the same time, I think with a manager and employee relationship requires mutual empathy. Really, it's a two-way relationship. And I even say this in interviews with people. I was like, this is we're having a conversation. We're having a
Yep.
conversation. If we like each other, you might not like me, I might not like you. We both right now, we both, it's not just me deciding if I'm going to hire you, right? Like
Mhm.
ask me your questions. Like this, we're dating right now, right? And so I think it really, I think when I see those TikToks, it is about like obviously they're for entertainment, but like it lacks that other side of empathy of like, oh, like what are this other stuff like my boss is going through right now? Because like, you know, when I worked at big corporate and all of that, I had to go to monthly review meetings and I had to report on the performance of the whole team in front of like even higher executive. I mean, I'm talking about people who manages like tens of billions of dollars in a P&L, right? And if you're not doing well, the vibe is not comfortable. They're not gonna have a nice conversation with you, right? There's actually just like a lot of tension, a lot of even like potentially like corporate aggression in those meetings because it is like we're talking about millions and millions, tens of millions of dollars. So um there's a different types of pressure that your boss is probably going through right now that you have no idea what that is. And
Mm.
your boss is just as human as you are,
Mhm.
right? They're not superheroes. They have feelings. They have maybe they have families, they have, life stressors just as you. We've gone through COVID as human beings all the same, right? And COVID's really like spiraled off a lot of additional stressors in our lives and how we look at work and the meaning of life in itself,
Mhm.
Yep.
right? So so I think, just as much as the manager, we talk about manager having that conversation and having that communication and empathy with the employee, I feel like the employees also need to have the same with managers, right? Like I'm like, yeah, I'm C-suite, but I also have people I report into and I extend the same type of, kind of like room for conversation when
Mhm.
I don't understand why some things are happening. Um, and, unless if your boss is, truly a black and white, just terrible person, but I would say that is the minority. Okay, the majority are normal people that got into people management and think about things in a more balanced way. um have that conversation if you don't understand what your boss is telling you, or you don't understand like if your boss is acting a little aggressive and you're not comfortable with that. Like instead of just being like, oh, well, my boss is just terrible, we're all adults, right? You can go and actually say, hey, I sense that, you might feel stressed about something. Like, is there something that's going on? Is there something that I'm doing that is, really affecting how you're feeling? Please can we have a conversation about this? And most of the time, your manager would really just welcome and appreciate that. I welcome all sort of proactive communication. I love it when somebody comes to me and say, "Hey, you said this thing at this meeting and I didn't really understand it. I thought that was like, it was conflicting with what, I feel like the company is going to." And then it gives me the opportunity, like, give me the opportunity to talk to you, you know? And so I think that's probably a large misconception of your boss is probably really stressed. And there's this data about actually a people manager has a 20% more more chance of being burnt out than a
Mhm.
individual contributor, because nowadays people managers have to do the work. They're not just general people managers. Nowadays, people managers have to have their own thing, like own piece of work to do, and be accountable for the work of the whole team, right? Um, so it is like a larger burden on the person.
Yeah. And I think a good manager is a shit umbrella. That's like always the term I use. Like a good manager keeps all the shit that's coming down on them away from their team, for better
Hmm.
or for worse, right? I think
Yeah,
that there's a really great book. It's called No Hard Feelings. I'm not going to remember the name of the authors right now, but I'll put it in the show notes. But there's a section around like selective vulnerability, and it's around like as a leader, you should be vulnerable with your people, but to an extent, because at a
yeah,
certain point, your burdens become their burdens. And
Hmm.
that's not fair to them because they don't get paid what you get paid to
hmm
worry about like this board meeting went off the rails, right? Like that's not
yeah,
really in their scope of things they should be concerned about. And they don't have all the context to be concerned about it. So it's this fine line of be showing that you're a human being, showing like asking for grace and empathy when you need it, but also keeping the things that are just going to be a distraction or stressful like away from your people. And I think that like that's like a nuance that to your point, Jane, I don't see in the sassy TikToks. It's like, yeah, but shit rolls downhill. If your
yeah,
boss is a dick,
Yeah.
it's probably because of something that's outside of their control that's influencing their behavior. To your point, Jane, I think most people go to work saying, I'm here to do the best I can and
Yeah.
try not to piss too many people off along the way.
Yeah.
yeah,
I think that's so true. And, Jane, I really liked, what you were sharing a little bit about kind of that accountability at the top. And it's funny, Megan and I were just having a conversation the other night, and I was sharing with her, for C-suite leaders, I think what people don't realize is it's lonely at the top, right? Like
oh yeah,
you're being held accountable, or in these conversations, like you shared that depiction of, being amongst, leaders and really articulating why you're not hitting your P&L. Why are we behind in ops and
yeah,
marketing? And so, that's one thing I've always tried to have empathy with for all of the C-suites that I interface with, is that it is only at the top. Like, you're accountable for your entire service line, maybe multiple service lines. And at the end of the day, the buck stops with you. And so, you talked a little bit about employees having conversations, and Megan and I often talk about managing up. And so
hmm
I wonder what your philosophy is around that, Jane, when people manage up.
yeah. I first learned how to manage up when I was a teenager. My dad actually told me that, I think it was like for my first internship, like, if you want to do well, you have to know what your boss wants, what your boss is trying to achieve. And I was like, okay, and I really took that to heart is, again, manager, C-suite, all of these people who manage people, we're again all human beings, right? We only have 24 hours a day. So when we hire people, we want to grow impact that's outside of our own personal ability. So when I think of like managing up is one, the first thing is, do I know um, what areas I can help my boss to achieve his or her goals, right? What is she trying to achieve? Two, like this is like level two management. Like, can I foresee what he and she might want in the future? I get ahead of that, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
I'm expert in this domain. I'm going to tell her, hey, in order for you to be even more successful, we can do one, two, three, and four that you've not even thought about. Okay. Help them think about the vision, contribute to the vision. And the third thing is just very practical. Like, what was she or he doing before that I can take off of his or her hands?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And really alleviating them and even making them trust me that, hey, I can do this and they don't even need to worry about it. I just bring home the bacon, right? And I think in if any employee, and again, even C-suites, even managers, they're employees themselves. So if they can do these three things, that is like achieving managing up, right? I think a lot of people think like managing up is just like, oh, like being really nice to your boss and being friends with your boss and like drinking with your boss or like whatever that you want to do, or and and
Or
and at
standing
the
up to
end of
your
the
boss, like a lot of
Yeah.
people
yeah.
think. Like managing
Yeah.
my boss is saying like I'm unhappy with you and this is why. Which I
Yeah.
still
Like,
think you should be able to do that, but that's not necessarily managing up. That's a different
yeah.
thing.
Like, wrong
Yeah.
answer. Eh.
Yeah, but I think at the end of the day, like your your boss is there for a reason. Your boss is there to complete a job and you're there to complete a job, right? So, right, if you can do those three things, that's what I think is like you know, the top of the line managing up. You don't need to be your manager's friend if you can do those three.
Mhm. Yeah. I think too another trap that both employees and managers fall into is if I get really friendly with my boss, if I hang out with them, if I drink with them or what have you, like they're going to be a better boss. They're going to like me more, all of that sort of stuff, which yeah, in short term, I think it's helpful, but in long term when like it just really confuses the
Yep.
relationship. Like it makes it really
Mm-hmm.
confusing, especially if things aren't going well or one
Mm-hmm.
or the other person isn't performing or God forbid the company has to riff and either the boss or the employee is on that list, right? And I implore people like don't be friends with your boss. Like, just
Yeah.
don't do wait until you don't work for them maybe. Like if you leave the company, like I've maintained good relationships with bosses like after I'm like they're not your friend.
Mm-hmm.
They shouldn't be
Yeah.
your friend because that's confusing for you. It's confusing for them. It's great if you all get along so well, but like that boundary is really important because at the end of the day,
Mm-hmm.
they're not your friend because they're accountable for you and your work. And then it just creates like a really messy dynamic.
Yeah, it does, right? You can be friendly with your boss. You can develop that relationship of trust, right? And even very deep trust with your boss. But yeah, like I think just talking about friends, like you can tell them your deepest, darkest secrets. Like, no, like please, like have that boundary somewhere because at the end of the day, right, like we're all thinking, we're all seeing like layoffs and all of that going around right now. And, layoffs at a company happen all the time, right? So for people who has not gone through that from a manager's perspective, you're basically being told who to who to lay off and who not to lay off.
And a lot of times it's not even your choice. I think
Yeah.
especially
Mhm.
for like mid-tier middle managers, it's just like, here's the list of people you have to fire this week. And you're like, but this person's great. And it's like, decision's already been
Yeah.
made, which
Mhm.
sucks. That's a different problem. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Or sometimes, it's a right. Sometimes it's a HR sort of consideration, right? You look at the comp bands and you look at
Uh-huh.
like performance numbers, and it is black and white. They don't know the actual person, but it needs and a business is a business. So and when if you have developed that relationship, you're gonna feel so betrayed, like so betrayed beyond like a normal working sort of situation. And that is just not a good place to be for anybody's sanity. So yes, boundaries, very important.
Don't be texting your boss on a Saturday about like the movie you just saw. Like,
I think it adds an element of emotion because we're human, right? And
Yeah.
so I say all the time that work is a transaction, right? Like we have a contract, which is my offer letter, that says the terms of what you're going to pay me for what I am supposed to contribute. And once you bring in that relationship component, and I'm a strong believer that, like, yeah, if you connect with someone, like you can have deep trust, you can have a good time. But once you take it to the level of friendship, it brings in this emotion that is not conducive for business. And it creates a bias, right? One recent situation I was privy to, not involved in, but privy to, was this one employee was complaining about this manager, saying, oh, she's not a good manager, you know, um, she's very sarcastic. She doesn't know how to lead. She doesn't know the work. So when I go to her, like I can't even get direction because she doesn't have any idea of the work that anyone's doing. And so
Mm,
that was reported to the director who was over that manager. But that manager and director are buds. So she had this lens where she couldn't
mm,
see it, right? And that manager had 100% turnover in their department and it still wasn't the manager. Like, oh, it can't be the manager. The manager's fine. It is the
mhm,
manager, but you can't see it because you're friends and you guys hang out and you guys
mhm,
text and go to games and do all this stuff. So you can't take your emotion out of it to see what is right in front of you. And I do believe that as leaders, you guys have an obligation, a duty to the organization and to the employees that report to you to be able to see things. And if there's something that's going to
mhm,
cloud your judgment, then as a leader, you should have an ethical duty to say, I'm not going to do that because I know I'm not going to be the best leader if I get myself entangled into this situation. And so I think that actually breaks trust, right? And oftentimes in the HR side of the house, I get complaints about that, right? Oh,
mhm,
Jane is playing favoritism with Megan because they hang out and
mhm,
they go to happy hour every Wednesday and they talk about us all the time. Well,
mhm,
it's hard for me to unpack the truth in that because I'm like, they have these pictures of you guys like, making kissy faces on Instagram and going to Paris and, so it's like, well, okay, so it's like, I think we have to really be mindful as leaders and individual contributors of what does this look like and how is this going to be conducive to the work environment, which I have an obligation to. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that because we're humans and we want to be liked and we want to have friends and we want to have a good time. But it's like, this is business.
and we spend
yeah,
like a lot of time at work. So we
Mm-hmm.
naturally get close to people we work with. It's hard.
yeah. But back to what you guys said before, it's very lonely at the top. When I got my first job as the head of a business unit, um, I think the first thing my boss said to me is like, just be prepared. It'll be very lonely. And I remember that there was one day, and we our office space was like an open office space. It was at lunchtime, and I had a team that like had really good energy with each other. Like they were all friends with each other. And I remember just like right at lunchtime, um, all of them would go to lunch together, and it would just be me sitting in the
Mm-hmm.
office. And I'm like, yeah, like I I want to go to lunch, like I want to be invited to lunch. But at the same time, I'm like, yeah, like I also respect the fact that they probably don't want to have lunch with their boss, like,
Mm-hmm.
and that is okay. Um,
Yeah, it is lonely at the top. But I also think I do want to like pivot to some of our earlier conversations as well of, all right, we've talked about, you know, your experience being a boss, Jane. We've talked about the empathy that we would hope employees would have for leaders. But now I want to get into like Spicy Town. And I would love you to hear you talk about what are some of your biggest pet peeves as a boss.
Mm.
And you don't have to identify specific people, but what are some
yeah.
things that like really grind your gears as a boss?
hmm Um, I mean, I definitely have a few. So the number one thing I think about is when people come to me and just keep on talking about the problem
Mm.
without talking about the solution. It's they just keep on saying, well, this thing is wrong, and we're having issues with this, and like, the customer is coming back having this poor response, and basically spend like 15-20 minutes talking about the problem, and I'm sitting there as like, and what are you going to do about it? Right? In my mind, it's, and I think, and people hear about this. I mean, I think I've seen this in social media. I've seen this like bring the solution and not the problem. But I've often seen that most people still just bring the problem. And you almost have to like, again, it's like you have to like train them in bringing you the solution first. So that's a pet peeve of mine. And what, as a manager, what I would prefer to hear is that, very concisely, this is the problem I'm having, but this is, these are the solutions I'm thinking about. I have solution 1, 2, 3, and I've looked into these solutions and I recommend solution 2 because of these reasons. Okay. Stop there, wait for your boss to ask questions,
Mm-hmm.
because your boss might not care about what the problem, what the details of the problem is. Just that, okay, you have a solution. I trust you. Your solution seems to make logical sense by what you're saying. Go forth, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if your manager cares about like the details of the problem, then you can talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um,
Always
that's like
give the too
pet
long
peeve.
didn't read, especially like the higher up your boss goes, like
Yeah.
punchline, get to the punchline
Yeah.
first. And I will say to the other side of what you said, if you are an employee and you have a problem and you don't know how to find the solution, then ask. Just regurgitating
Mm-hmm.
the problem over and over. I think some of that is a lack of clarity. I think it's like, I have this problem and I don't know how to fix it. Will you
Mm-hmm.
help
Yeah.
me? And so I think as long
hmm
as you kind of like you have to be clear on what you're asking.
Yeah.
Don't go and bitch about a problem. Talk about it and say, I have a solution. Here it is, like you were just saying, Jane. Or I don't know what the solution is, and I could use your help
hmm
on this. Because at the end
hmm
of the day, your boss should also want to help you, but they don't
Yeah.
necessarily want to hear you complain.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, exactly. If you can't think of any solution, I don't think a boss will ever fault you for like not having any solution if you just genuinely don't, right? Um, but yeah, just I would say if there needs to be a hard rule, just never spend more than 5 minutes explaining a problem to your
Amen.
boss.
Amen. Amen. But to add a little more color to that, I think a lot of that is wrapped up in the fear of failure, right? Because oftentimes maybe people are fearful of putting forth this recommendation because either they had a terrible rollout that failed a month ago, and maybe, their leader had some strong response to that. So now they're like, I'm not going to say anything. You micromanage me to the solution. Or it's self-esteem, right? And not inspiring your staff to want to grow and stretch, and think of creative ideas outside of the box. And I always try to inspire people to do that. Like, we don't have to solve it the way we did last time. Like,
Mm-hmm.
what do you think? you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think, like the manager also have a play in this, right? Like if I'm finding that a lot of people are not giving me solutions because they're fearful, again, like if you find that your employees are not giving you solutions, you know, I usually ask like, well, what do you think the solution is? Right? And get to the bottom, like why they don't have a solution. Maybe they don't have resources that they think they have,
Mm-hmm.
right? Maybe, like you said, maybe they're fearful of coming up with a solution that they feel, I might think it's stupid, but honestly, that rarely happens. So I think it's just like getting to that, like the manager and the employee both equally have the responsibility of, again, communication, having that conversation and getting to the bottom of it. But at the same time, right, as the employee, you should always try your best to come up with a solution. And if in the instance that you don't have the resources you need to solve the problem, ask for the resource. Just say, hey, I think I have a way to solve it, but I don't have this resource. Can you give it to me?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Proactively ask for things. I always tell my team, like, ask for budget, ask for like tools that will help you, because if you don't ask for it, what is going to happen? It means that I have to go find the tools for you, and I don't have time to find the tools for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or I have to go and like estimate what the budget is, and I don't have time to do that, right? So I would say just not be fearful of asking for things. And,
Mm-hmm.
and all of these things, all of these, approaches that I'm talking about that an employee can do or even should do. And if you're getting a poor response, like if you're coming up with solutions and your boss is saying, these are terrible solutions and just berate you on it, okay? Again, you always have a decision to be like, this is not a good working environment. This is
Mm-hmm.
not a good environment for me to grow, because this person is not going to enable me to grow and, you know, spruce up your resume.
Yeah.
You
My
always have a choice.
Yes.
my solution on this show is typically just quit your job. I'm a big like,
Jane,
just leave then. Go
she
find a different one.
she has told me maybe since January 1st of 2024, maybe 50 times, just quit.
Just quit your job.
Yeah.
That's usually the solution. No, but I think that's so true. Like, again, it is a contract, and it should be your relationship with your boss shouldn't be contentious.
Mm-hmm.
And I think too, if it hits a state of contention, it's very hard to come back from. So this is where y'all have to look out for yourselves. And if you do
Mm-hmm.
have the boss that won't give you the resources, that won't give you the time, I think that's like
Mm-hmm.
a big complaint that I hear a lot. Like, won't give you what you need to be successful. Like, you could try to escalate. Sometimes that works, sometimes it makes it worse.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
you can just go find an environment that's going to appreciate you and allow you to grow. They are out there. There are great bosses like Jane out there. So you can
Yeah.
go find them.
Yeah, one thing I always tell, I mean, I have a lot of like mentor-mentee relationships with my previous team members that I like to foster. And I always tell them that when you're looking for your first job, or actually when you're looking for any job, make sure you like your boss in the
Hmm.
interview.
Hmm.
Really, make sure your boss is a balanced person, is a reasonable person, and I think it's like it's rarely about the job description itself that is going to develop you. Your success is very much dependent on your boss
Hmm.
um, in a corporate environment, right? They're going to give you the resources, they're going to give you the opportunities to test and be creative. They're going to give you the time to train you, to develop you, and also make you feel confident, right? Sometimes it is a confidence issue. And if you have a boss that is always top down and making you feel like you can't think for yourself, you're not going to develop the confidence you need to
Hmm.
succeed in this world. So, please interview your bosses before you accept the job.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and listen to your gut. I think
Mm.
that's the other
Yeah.
thing too. Like maybe the job is great, the company's awesome, the pay is stellar or whatever. But if there's this like little lingerie down in the pit of your stomach, is like, I don't know if I'm going to gel with this person, like, don't do it. Because your boss really does make or break your experience and your mental
Yeah.
health. Like you see a lot of
Yeah.
memes now is like, your boss is the biggest contributor to your mental health. I think that's like absolutely true.
I
Yeah.
always tell people that, people sue their boss, not the company, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
And so I think, oftentimes people want to downplay the dynamic and what that relationship really produces, for the long term piece. But I also think it's important as well for employees, whether it's a leader or individual contributor, to know what they want, right? I think so many times, and I've coached so many people on this, like pause and get clear about what are your desires, because oftentimes I see relationships break down when someone doesn't know what they want. They're leaning on Jane to say, "What do you think my next career move should be?" No, 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 no. You should be clear about what you desire, and then your
Mm-hmm.
leader is there to help foster those skills or give you the door to grow in them. And so sometimes that power dynamic is skewed a little bit because the person doesn't have a understanding of what it is they're seeking. And then what happens is, yeah, your boss will impose things on you and you say, yeah, even though that's not what you want. And so I always tell people, give yourself space to get clear about, what it is you want for your professional development or your
Mm-hmm.
growth track. And then you can collaborate with your leader and say, hey, Jane, this is what I'm thinking about. Like, can you share with me like what opportunities or what trainings or what support you have? And so I think it's a little bit too of, taking your power back,
Mm-hmm.
and knowing what is it that I want out of this relationship? What is it I want out of my future career? And then collaborating with your leader to get there, right? And partnering on that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think one thing the great long-term relationships I've developed with my team members before have stemmed from me, like when they were on my team, I talked to them about like how can we use this platform to help you develop your skills, so that it's your skill, right? And then you can take it and you can develop your career. Um, and I think employees and a team member like really appreciate that because yeah, like you always want to get better at something and develop yourself. Even me, myself, like I always look for opportunities to be developed in other areas, right? Um, so I think like being very clear, like you said, about maybe you don't exactly know what you want, but you have a general idea, right? And just say, okay, I kind of want to try out, for example, like web development, but I'm in marketing right now. And your boss can give you opportunities to try it out without actually putting you in that position, right? And you
Mhm.
can develop those skills. And so definitely speak up, and I say this because in a way, as much as I don't like this and I try not to be this type of boss, but in a way, the squeaky wheel does get the oil. And I try to also pay attention, to the quiet ones, but the people who speak up does get more of my time. The
Mhm.
people who say, "Hey, I want to try this, I want to try that," I give them that sooner because I know sooner.
Mhm.
Um, so don't be afraid to really share what you want out of the role and out of like being a part of that company.
Mm, yeah.
Yeah.
So insightful. Thank you, Jane. I think maybe to start to wrap us up here, we usually like to ask our guests to give, kind of three practical takeaways. And so I would love to hear from your perspective. What are three takeaways our listeners can think about to improve their relationship with their boss?
Practical takeaways. Okay. Number one is be proactive in your communication.
Mm.
Um, don't assume your boss knows what you're thinking. And also, bosses don't assume your employees know what you're thinking, right? If you have an idea or if you have a concern or anything, I would say give give your boss to have the opportunity to respond to what you're thinking and what you're feeling instead of being fearful and just brewing within yourself and then being more and more unhappy about the job and all of that. So I think having being proactive in communication is important. um the second thing, I still say, when you're interviewing and finding a new job, make sure you like your boss. That is number one. You're because even if the pay is good, you're not staring at your paycheck every day, but you're staring at your boss every day. Right? So make sure that um, if you don't have the chance to interview with your boss, ask for that chance, ask for that conversation. Um, I would also say like request potentially talking to peers, of the
Mm-hmm.
team to understand what the energy is like. I think a lot of people's mental health is very influenced by your work life. And to do a favor for yourself and your own health and mental health, absolutely make sure you're going to love the people that you work with. That's what I found. The people is the number one thing I look for in a job. Like you can put me in a very, shitty office, and I would still be happy if the people I'm working with are amazing, you know, peers and partners and all of that. So that's number two. The third thing I would say is just never assume.
Mm.
Um, and I say this because like whatever your boss is coming down on you with, or anything that you feel like maybe it's not just your boss, maybe you feel like upper management isn't making a lot of sense or whatever, never assume you know the whole picture, because I guarantee you 99% of the time you don't.
Yeah.
You do not know what all the considerations are when it comes to any like major decision making of a company, because there's things that just are not are confidential, right? And so if so I would say just let go of that like self brewing negativity, because that does not, and this is for everybody, right? That does not bode well with your own health and your own sort of energy, right? That doesn't help how you're going to end up performing at your work. It might even, impact how you interact with people in your personal lives. Um, so I think it's that like negativity that people have because they assume the worst out of somebody, or they assume the worst out of a company. Try to let that go. Meditation, that's a very tactical advice. Meditation does really well to just get out of that negativity.
Great.
Mm.
Well, I think that was some really insightful information to share with our listeners. And I hope that they can apply some of those practical tips into their everyday life. And so, Jane, I just want to say thank you so very much for this meaningful dialogue and inviting our listeners into this space of what leaders are going through, because oftentimes that piece of the conversation is missing. And so we thank you for being open with us today.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. This was fun.
Yeah, Jane, if folks are interested with connecting with you or learning more from you, what are some spaces they can find you out there on the interwebs?
Yeah, so currently I'm just on LinkedIn, Jane Yan. So Megan can put out my link there. I am thinking about putting together a TikTok, talking about just the opposite side of complaining about bosses, but a little bit sharing about what bosses are going through. But that is to come.
Yeah. Well, listeners, if you like hearing Jane's opinions on these things and you think she should do her TikTok, find her on LinkedIn and send her little bodes of confidence, because I think she should do it.
Me too.
Again, Jane, thank you so much for the time. Listeners, thanks for tuning in. And as always, if you have your own stories, you can find us at stories@offlineandunfiltered.com. You can send us an email or submit your story on our website, www.offlineandunfilteredpod.com. Thank you so much for listening. Bye.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. The views expressed on this show are based on our personal opinions and should not be taken as legal advice. Contact an attorney for that.
Our theme music and sound was produced by Equilibrium. Our artwork and logo was created by Jillian Blanco. We are an independently run podcast. If you like our show, please rate and review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to share your story or expertise, email us at stories@offlineandunfiltered.com. We can't wait to hear from you.